Hello, my name is RT Brown, and I'm the Director of Business Acceleration with the Brattleboro Development Credit Corporation. I focus on programs such as Instigate for emerging businesses, Business Acceleration for growth stage businesses, and our Micro Entrepreneur Loan Program for businesses that aren't able to obtain traditional financing. And of course, Regenerate, our program to help businesses navigate ownership succession. Over the last few years, and a collaborator with our Regenerate program is the Vermont Employee Ownership Center. They've been providing leadership, direct technical assistance, and consultation to businesses in the region and across the state who are thinking about different succession models. With me today is Matt Croft. He's the Executive Director of the Vermont Employee Ownership Center. Matt received his MA in History from UVM in 2011, where he studied economic history and the origins of cooperative finance. He started with VEOC, correct me if I'm wrong, Matt, in 2014. Matt, thanks for taking some time to talk with me. This is going to be conversational nature, so we're not going to be terribly formal with this, but why don't we start with you introducing yourself and perhaps providing an overview of VEOC in your own words.
Yep, and thanks for the intro. That was correct. I've been executive director of the organization since October of 2020. Previous to that, I was co-executive director with our founder Don Jameson, and the Employee Ownership Center got it started about 20 years ago in 2001, and kind of officially hired staff and really launched in 2002. So we're, depending on how you look at it, we're at or near our 20th anniversary. We're a nonprofit with a mission to promote and foster broad-based employee ownership for a variety of impact goals, right? Job retention, broad-based opportunities for wealth building among working people, community stability in terms of companies and company succession being done in a way that keeps those companies and communities. And so we do a lot of kind of different things. We're a small team, so we certainly support some groups that try to start businesses that are employee owned from the get-go, but a lot of our work is around ownership succession. And so when a business owner is thinking, okay, what is important for me about what happens next to my business when I'm done with it, whether they're a serial entrepreneur and looking to move on to their next thing, or looking to retirement and have spent 40 years building this business and are looking at what the options are to exit. One of our key activities is oftentimes sitting down for one-on-one conversations with business owners, talk through their goals, their timelines, learn a bit about the business, and see if broad-based employee ownership is something that could be a good fit for both their financial goals, their personal goals, their legacy goals, all of those things you have to consider when you're looking to exit a business. And I should clarify that when we talk about employee ownership, I said broad-based employee ownership, and we define that as forms of ownership where all full-time equivalent employees have a path to becoming a co-owner of the business. So there's lots of examples of things where you might sell to a manager, or sell to a smaller group that become partners, and while those are valid paths, those aren't really what we specialize in. We specialize in these things where everyone from the guy sweeping the floor to the folks in the C-suite can have some stake in the success of the business at an ownership level, not just at a compensation level.
Great. And since your involvement with VEOC, have you seen interest in these different models growing?
Yes. So, when I started, again, we've been around for a while and we have kind of a pipeline. So there's kind of a steady drumbeat. And oftentimes it's a long process of talking to business owners where, a conversation might start and then they get busy and disappear for a few years and then come back up. And there, I think one of the companies when I first started that converted to employee stock ownership plan that year, looking back through the ye grand old spreadsheet, Don, our kind of co-founder, had his first contact with them 10 years prior. So,
oh, wow.
There's definitely some things where it's just kind of keeping in touch, and when folks are ready, they're ready, but it's a big decision. Yeah. More recently, we've definitely been seeing a big uptick where at the start of the pandemic, obviously, along with everything else, things quieted down, way down for the first 6 months. But since then, we've seen in the current year, normally we see, maybe, I think, 2 to 3 businesses convert in a year. This year, in terms of conversions and startups, we're already at 4, and there's a 5th that looks like it's going to flip soon. And and we've got several more that look like it might happen towards the end of the year. So in terms of actual activity, it's higher than usual. And certainly also in terms of inquiries and first contacts, and since probably I'd say since August or September of 2020 was when everything felt like it started to thaw out, and a lot of people had, suddenly these existential questions around, wow, this is what am I doing with my life? What do I want to do with my business?
Right.
Maybe it's a time to, make decisions rather than push them off further. So I think there's been a lot of that. And then the other thing that we have seen is a lot more kind of entrepreneurial activity than normal, both in terms of folks who've worked together and were on unemployment and we're like, hey, we like each other. We think we understand the business. We think we can go into business together.
Right.
But also, people who, are just deciding, hey, I want to start something and I want to kind of have shared ownership from the get-go with a team of other folks.
Right.
So, we're seeing more activity than usual on multiple fronts.
Well, that's great. That's awesome. All right. Okay, for our next topic, we will be discussing worker-owned cooperatives. That is another area that the Vermont Employee Ownership Center will work with folks on understanding and navigating. So Matt, if you wouldn't mind taking a few minutes talking about worker-owned cooperatives.
Great. Yes. So, the worker co-ops are the other major form of broad-based employee ownership we work with, along with employee stock ownership plans. And they have some key differences from them and occupies a little bit of a different niche primarily. Probably the biggest thing for us kind of practically is that they're possible for very small companies. Whereas the employee stock ownership plan model, you've got to have at least say 20 employees or so. You can have a company with 4 or 5 employees can become a worker co-op. And certainly it's not limited to those small companies, but it's something where the floor is much lower. And there's, we have companies with 50, 70 employees in Vermont that are also owned this way. Okay. So, it's also the other kind of key difference is it's a form of more direct ownership, whereas with an ESOP, there's a retirement plan that owns the company on behalf of employees. The company makes contributions and employees kind of build up ownership in their retirement accounts. A worker co-op is more of a direct form of ownership, where each member buys 1 share, which entitles them to 2 major categories of things. One is rights to participate in governance. So each member who's worked there for whatever the period of time you need to work there before you're invited into ownership, has the right to vote for the board of directors, and participate in certain major governance decisions like, all right, do we want to sell the company? All right, everyone's going to need to vote on that. Do we want to sort of move the company? Things along those lines. And the elected board then is responsible for setting policy and strategic direction for the company, and just like most corporate boards, providing goals and supervising the general manager, that sort of thing. The other piece is a share of profit. And one of the things that when people hear about this model, a lot of times the first thing their mind goes to is like, oh, it's like a partnership. But sort of the key difference between this and a partnership kind of is in the sort of how the ownership works out. So oftentimes in a partnership where you're like, okay, we have 2 owners or 3 owners, we each earn half of the company or a third of the company or something like that. The way that value is delivered to the partners is both potentially through, okay, you might do distributions of profit, but also that half or third of the company is going to generally be treated as having a value, right? And so if a partner wants to leave and they own a third of the company, you're going to need to figure out what is the value of the company, do a valuation of the company, and buy out that third. With a worker co-op, the kind of member share price is actually fixed. And so when you come in, it might be something where you say you're going to buy your member share for $2,000 or $5,000. And then when you leave, you're not revaluing the company and saying, oh, you owned 15% of it and therefore you get 15% of the value of the company. You get the value, the price of your share back. So in some ways, you can almost think of that member share as kind of a deposit that you receive back. And then
Next question.
Yep.
Okay, so let's say you have a small operation. Let's say it's a coffee shop or something like that, and you have, three founding members, and the members just have different capacities in terms of what they can contribute to the starting of the business. So if member A can put in 2/3, or let's say half of the startup costs, and the other two members can only do 25%, does the member who is able to put in half just get more ownership shares to start?
So oftentimes what will happen in a situation like that is you'll have two classes of shares. Okay. So you'll have the member shares, which basically give the governance rights and the share of profit, which I'll get into how that works in a minute. And then you'll either have a second class of shares, which are non-voting preferred shares or B shares, or even you can just structure it as a form of patient debt, where you say, okay, in the startup phase, different people contributed different amounts. You could even use something like, and a lot of startups use something like the slicing pie model. Yeah. And then you take whatever is beyond the price of that individual member share, and you structure something where, say, traditionally, oftentimes preferred shares and co-ops are set up such that it's like, okay, as long as the co-op they exist, the first slice of profit up to, say, a 5% or 6% dividend is paid on those shares, and any profit beyond that goes to the member.
I see. Okay.
And then the company always has the right to buy those shares back at face value. So over time they can kind of be retired. And that's also the source of external investment. So for instance, VSECU which is a state chartered credit union, which Vermont allows state chartered credit unions to make equity investments in other cooperatives. So they have a fund called the Co-op Capital Fund that will buy, I think their maximum is like $150,000 of this kind of instrument from any particular co-op. So if a company is either trying to convert, the business owner is trying to sell into this model, or the group is trying to start up something with this model, either that or friends and family raise or other things can kind of come in through that kind of mechanism. Okay. But what it does is it retains kind of control in the hands of the employees, and it also, because it's non-voting stock, and it also kind of has a limited upside. So it's not something where you're going to get a 5x return on your investment when there's an exit, but it's more, you get the first slice of profit as long as the company is successful, and then you get your principal back when the company has the sufficient funds to start retiring those shares.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it's great. What I didn't understand is that you could have different class of shares within so that's the
yeah. So the other thing in this, in terms of the mechanics of so for those members, the sharing of profit is, generally people are, it's employee ownership, right? So they're employees of the cooperative, and they're also owners of the cooperative. So they're going to get a paycheck just like you would as an employee. Yeah. And then at the end of the year, if there's available profit, the profit is usually divided up kind of through what the technical term in the co-op world is patronage. So it's basically, you take in the case of a worker co-op, it's you take the total labor contribution of all the members, whether that's measured in hours worked, or that could be measured in W-2 income, or you could weight it a little bit with seniority, and then you divide up the profit by whatever metric you've decided to use, and then you might pay out some of that immediately in cash to the members as their kind of distribution of profit. You can also, and a lot of co-ops will also decide, okay, we want to retain a certain amount of that as working capital. And so anything that's kind of attributed to members but not actually distributed as cash, it goes into an internal capital account that can be used for working capital, but it's a claim that each member has on the co-op. So when you leave the co-op, what you leave with, and to offboard people, and this is kind of one of those other differences with a partnership, between this and a partnership, because it makes it a little bit more predictable, is that what you owe the person is the share that they put in, which could be anywhere in Vermont. The last time we surveyed worker co-ops, the lowest was $250, the highest was $15,000. Okay. So could be anywhere in that range or even beyond that range. So you get your share back, plus you get whatever kind of retained earnings were attributed in your name, and some might be paid immediately, might be paid over the course of a few years, something like that. But so rather than having to be like, okay, well, we need to bring in third party in, do evaluation, and then buy out your pro rata percentage of the thing, you have kind of a clear number there. So
Okay.
worker co-ops tend to sort of be a little bit more, have less friction in terms of onboarding and offboarding owners than partnerships.
Okay. Okay. Great. Well, so what's a classic example of a Vermont based owner cooperative?
Yeah, so you've got a few examples. Catamount Solar is one, that the solar installation. PT360 is probably one of the bigger ones in the state, where they have their physical therapy practice, where they have several locations.
Yep.
I think our biggest in terms of number of employees, employee owners, is the New School of Montpelier, which is this kind of specialized private school that the owner or the founder sold to the employees in 2015.
Okay.
On the flip side, you have plenty of examples of little tiny ones like Vermont Computing Co-op in Randolph. Was founded by a group of 3 or 4 people, where the founder decided he wanted to move on to the next project, and the employees were like, yeah, all right, let's take this on, right? So you have like some that have come into being as from startups, some that could have come into being as conversions from existing businesses or buyouts, right? So I think at last count we had somewhere in the neighborhood of 20 in the state.
Okay. And for anyone that's interested in finding out some more information, or maybe they're starting their path down employee worker-owned cooperatives, go to your website, fill out the information, the contact form. Is that the best?
Yep. Okay. Yeah, definitely happy again to have a conversation. There's also a great resource library that I'd recommend looking at. That's hosted by the Democracy at Work Institute, so institute.coop. And there's one document there in particular that I think is really helpful, because it gets into a lot of times, for if you're a business owner thinking about this, that's the kind of question of the thing that comes up both from business owners' perspectives and initially from employees' perspectives, as they're just kind of thinking, could this even be possible? Is where will the money come from? Because it's something where you're like, okay, maybe your employees don't have the ability to come up with it themselves. So if you look for a document called The Lending Opportunity of a Generation, that really gets into sort of the nitty gritty of, okay, how does a deal like this work? Okay. And what realistically does are the financial resources available? And there are some unique financial resources specifically aimed at these sorts of things that can make it more feasible than you would think. And one thing I would tag in particular is the question of personal guarantees. For a lot of small business lending, that can be something that's very scary and can be a barrier, right? Where oftentimes if you're like, okay, I want to sell to my manager, and maybe the manager basically needs to put all of their assets on the line in order to become the new owner of the business. Personal guarantees are sort of tricky for 2 reasons with worker co-ops. One is that that there's sort of an equitability issue, where if you have a bunch of owners and there's one person who's late career and owns a house and would have a lot on the line, and there's someone who just got out of college and maybe owns their car, and all right, that's all you could take, right? But there's also the question of because there is more fluidity in being able to bring on new owners and offboard old owners, having to update guarantee documentation can also be kind of onerous. And so a lot of the more specialized lenders, like the Cooperative Fund of New England, that are very familiar with these kinds of co-op deals, will tend to actually not require personal guarantees on the parts of the worker owners. And so that's, in terms of those kinds of like sources of anxiety from folks who are like, all right, what is at risk for me if I do this? Oftentimes it's like, okay, it's that share you're putting down, you are going to have some skin in the game, but it's not like you're generally not going to be asked to put your house on the line in order to make this happen, because there are these kind of mission-based capital providers that can be more flexible than a more traditional lender, understanding the nuances of how this model works.
Oh, that's fascinating. That's great to understand. Well, Matt, thank you so much for chatting with me about worker cooperatives. I appreciate it very much.
Definitely happy to do it.